Gainsborough often complained about the pressures of society portraiture, yet it was in doing this particular work that he earned a living. His skills as an artist afforded him the attention of the well-established English gentry, although he came from a modest family. The high society portraiture I will particularly be talking about is Mr. and Mrs. Andrews and Mr. and Mrs. William Hallett in The Morning Walk. Both Mr. and Mrs. Andrews and Mr. and Mrs. Hallett in The Morning Walk are by Sir Thomas Gainsborough from different parts of his life. Gainsborough painted Mr. and Mrs. Andrews in 1750. It is in oil on canvas, and it is 69 times 119 centimeters. Mr. and Mrs. William Hallett were painted in 1785 with oil on canvas. Their portrait was 236 by 179 centimeters, considerably larger than the Andrews painting, which he did 35 years prior. I'd like to argue that these two paintings are quite similar, but quite different because they are the perfect representation of how Gainsborough artistically aged over time. Like I mentioned before, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews was painted in 1750. The painting depicts Robert Andrews and Frances Carter while he is standing and she is sitting on a bench in a rural landscape that was the Aubrey's estate, which was part of their dowry at marriage. The landscape behind the couple is carefully rendered, featuring lush trees, cornfields, and rolling hills. There is supreme color balance, complexity in the clouds, and hidden church towers revealed through the trees. Far away in the middle of the portrait is the Church of All Saints, where they were married. Frances was promised to Robert at the age of 15 or 16, making their union quite unromantic. For the elder Mr. Andrews, their relationship was more of a business transaction. At first glance, these two seem to be an idyllic country couple. However, as you look closer, things get more complicated and fascinating. I feel there is a bit of quirkiness or tension in the painting. The husband is standing next to a dog while casually holding a rifle. This implies that he had just been out hunting, which is also another signal of wealth. He's postured towards her, but she is facing away from him. His pose implies that his work is done, he has more than enough money, and he can kick back and hunt. He has a smirk of self-assurance, probably hoping the portrait will portray their wealth and social status. His expression also seems to be a facade, and it doesn't even seem like Gainsborough is buying it. Frances, on the other hand, is displaying a peculiar emotion. Although both of her eyes are pointed towards the viewer, she's giving more of a side eye. She looks like she has a secret that she wants to tell. Her anger is a mix of anger, spite, or boredom. It's the emotion of contempt, with maybe some sort of disdain or disrespect. Maybe she is unfaithful to her husband, or angry that she's in an empty and unromantic relationship. Her dress is light blue silk with white details. Another key detail is that the area around her hands is unfinished. No one knows what was supposed to be there, but there is speculation that it might have been a dead bird that her husband successfully caught on a day of hunting. Mr. and Mrs. Andrews is a beautifully crafted portrait that captures both the wealth and the relationship of a privileged couple in the 18th century England. His attention to the lavish countryside shows his lifelong love for nature. He was more famous for his portraits, but he insisted that landscape painting was his true passion and mostly considered himself one. The platform that he gave to the nature behind Mr. and Mrs. Andrews shows the early stages of his painting career, when he had more freedom and before he was an established portrait painter. I believe that Gainsborough successfully portrayed what the couple wanted him to highlight, while also giving the viewer a sense of mystery about them that Mr. and Mrs. Andrews may not have liked the viewer to see. Mr. and Mrs. William Hallett, also known as The Morning Walk, is a double full-length portrait of William Hallett and Elizabeth Stephen, painted before their wedding. The man and woman are walking together in a lush country landscape. We do not know whose land it is. The woman is wearing a white dress with a black sash and a hat with ostrich feathers on top. The man is wearing a brown coat, black pants, and hat. The couple is walking on a dirt path that winds through the forest of trees, and they are surrounded by green foliage and colorful flowers. The sunset comes down onto her ivory-colored silk dress on the left-hand side with a lovely echo of green on the bow at her breast and mirrored up in the hat, which is very fashionable and flamboyant. There is a mistiness of her top and the dress that allows you to see the base color of the painting. The color of the dog melts in with her dress as if they are one with each other. Both of them also meld into the background. There is a warmness in the background, but juxtaposed with the black and white of Mr. and Mrs. Hallett. This couple is ignoring the audience while looking at something in the distance. The dog seems to be waving its tail excitedly while looking enthusiastically at the couple. Everything is moving. The couple does not look happy, and we know that Elizabeth's life probably was difficult as her husband's ultimate downfall was caused by a gambling problem. This painting is characterized by Gainsborough's light feather brushwork and attention to the subjects, which is more typical in his later style. I believe in both of the portraits Gainsborough told more of a story with the woman. The dog is more connected to the woman. There are more details in the clothing and the expressions in the woman than the men, and the skies are more connected to the woman. In both portraits, the sky is lighter on the side of the woman and darker on the side of the man. The sky is also the same color as both of the woman's dresses. The dogs are both looking at the woman. The dog in Mrs. Hallett's portrait is staring at her, and same with Mrs. Andrews. This is possibly because both of the women had rougher lives than the men, and that the men brought the woman into the darkness. Both couples clearly want the viewer to know that they are wealthy, as Gainsborough portrayed both of them with various symbols of wealth. For Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, the countryside and their estate, their dog, their ability to hunt, their clothing, the paleness in their faces, all symbolize their wealth and privilege. Although the Halletts were shown in the clothing that they presumably got married in, their clothes are also far too ostentatious to be wearing in the countryside. The Halletts are also very pale, showing that they don't have a day of work, and that they are very wealthy. Although there are two of Gainsborough's portraits of married couples, they actually highlight the two ends of the spectrum of Gainsborough's portrait paintings. He had painted Mr. and Mrs. Andrews first, which shows in the way the color pops. It seems like because the picture is more detailed and brighter, maybe Gainsborough was more excited to be painting it as he was painting it in his earlier career. Because he's so fond of landscape, it seems that he put more effort and color into Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. If you look at the Halletts, there is far less color in the landscape and the people. In other words, you can tell he grows tired of painting the wealthy society portraits when you look at how much color are in Mr. and Mrs. Andrews compared to Mr. and Mrs. Hallett, but he still leaves color to his favorite thing, the landscape. When looking at the two of them, you can also see a shift in his painting style. The portrait of the Andrews is painted with little and detailed strokes, while the Halletts are swift and misty strokes. Gainsborough became a very fast portrait artist, which his strokes reveal in his later work. The swift brushstrokes also make everything seem to be moving, while his earlier portrait is a still life. Lastly, the Andrews are looking right at the viewer and telling a story with their eyes, but the Halletts are looking into the distance, leaving the viewer to wonder what they are looking at. The morning is also far bigger than the Andrews. When Gainsborough moved to Bath, he moved from small-scale conversation pieces into much more ambitious full-scale portraits like Mr. and Mrs. Hallett. These two portraits show the trajectory of an artist rising in status and experience. These are great demonstrations of how Gainsborough stuck to his true passion of landscape painting, but shifted in style as he continued to paint high society portraiture. Thank you.